welcome to episode number 4 of Cloud Cadet, Linux Academy's new how-to podcast. We're here with Christoph, co-hosting. Hello, Christoph.
Hey, how you doing?
Pretty good. And today our guest speaker or host or whatever you want to call it is Steven. Say hello, Steven.
Hello.
And I am Anthony from linuxacademy.com. Actually, we are, in fact, all from linuxacademy.com. So what we're going to do today is we're going to be working with Steven. Steven had just released a new course of his. It's underneath our AWS section. It's called Active Directory and Amazon Web Services. So, Steven, tell us a little bit about this, why it's important, and actually what you're going to be showing us how to do today.
Yeah, you bet. So this course is kind of stemmed around the need for a lot of enterprises out there that either already have existing Active Directory for their credential needs and or are looking to move to use Active Directory for their credential needs to be able to use both on-premise sites. So you have some workstations, you have some servers on-prem, but you also are starting to extend that environment out into AWS's VPCs. And you want to be able to have all of those servers and workstations to be able to use, centralized login. So what I'm going to actually show today is an existing environment that I have built. I have 2 separate AWS accounts with 2 separate VPCs. And what I've actually spun up in those particular VPCs are VPN instances, which we actually walk through in this course on how to set those up. And since we've extended 2 separate environments, we are then going to use an already existing Active Directory domain controller in one of those environments. And we're going to bind a Linux server using an AD credential to that Active Directory environment.
Well, that sounds fantastic. So let's go ahead and get started here. Do you want to share your screen and show us what you're going to walk through here? Do you have any questions while he does that, Christoph?
No, it looks good to me.
Fantastic. This was a highly requested course. It's one of those things that is a little bit harder, easier said than done, I guess is the best way of putting it. So Steven worked quite a while on this, and it looks pretty good. It's about 3 hours long. And it should take you through all of the fun AWS directory and AWS service options using Active Directory and trusts and simple AD service and site-to-site VPN and all that great stuff, which I think you just said, Steven, but since I'm waiting on you, I'm just repeating everything.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, we actually talk about some of the hosted solutions that are, Amazon managed Active Directory services, such as Simple AD or even the Enterprise Active Directory managed services as well. Today, what we're actually going to do, though, in this first window tab over here, I'm in an AWS account, and I'm in North Virginia. I have a VPC set up, and in this particular VPC, I have a instance running. It's the Amazon machine image that Amazon has available. And then over here in another AWS account, I have another Amazon machine image set up with a Linux that has a site-to-site open VPN. It's actually Open Swan VPN that does this site-to-site connection. So for example, here in my terminal, I am in over here. So 101, let's see. So this is going to be our California. So right now I'm in California on a Linux instance. In this tab right here, I'm in US East. So I'm over on the East Coast in a completely different subnet. But again, these 2 accounts in AWS are tied together with this Open Swan VPN. So over here in our console in North Virginia, I'm on a subnet of 172.16.57, right? Over in California, I have a domain controller running that's in 172.31.9 subnet. Again, different account, completely separate. But I should be able to ping this domain controller in California. Notice we're in California from North Virginia. So let's go ahead and actually do that. So I'm going to ping that IP address coming from the East Coast to the West Coast and separate accounts. So this is what allows the communications between those subnets to take place. It's this open VPN connection that I have set up. So we're not going to go through the setting that up. I just want to show you what's available and what we can actually do with a lot of these open source technologies. And this happens to be between 2 AWS accounts, but you could certainly do this between an on-premises network. So you have a data center somewhere in Kansas City, And in that Kansas City data center, we can set up an instance, and with the help of your network team, whether you manage that or someone else on your network manages that, we talk about that in our course on how to set that up. So the idea is, regardless if it's between multiple AWS accounts and or an AWS account and you're on-prem, you can certainly have a site-to-site VPN connection set up.
And real quick question on this. My guess is that it's also between multiple VPCs within a single AWS account. So, for example, VPC peering really only works in individual, and this is more of a kind of private network, but that only works in individual regions. So you can configure OpenVPN between, or VPN connection between the two.
Yeah,
and it doesn't matter at all what region it is. It works for every single region.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah, to do an open VPN, it would be, and again, that's why I stress the fact that regardless of whether it's, multiple different regions in AWS or different accounts in AWS going from one region to the other, and or your on-premise network that's completely outside of AWS, all of the networking scope that takes place it allows you to do that. So it's very powerful. There's a question we get quite a bit, and if you are going over Anthony's professional course, this is something I do believe that they talk about, or in hybrid connections, on what it takes to be able to tie in, different regions with VPC.
We do.
Awesome. All right. So what we're actually going to do now, since I've demonstrated the fact that these two separate AWS accounts, these two separate VPCs, are tied together network-wise, I have another instance set up. It's a Linux instance. And what we're going to do today is we're actually going to bind this Linux instance into our Active Directory domain. Before we do that, let's go ahead and let's just take a look at what I have set up. So this particular server right here is an actual EC2 instance. It's set up in AWS. It doesn't matter, again, if this EC2 instance was an AWS or if it was an actual physical and or virtual server sitting in your on-prem environment. The point here is this particular Active Directory is ad.linuxacademy.com. And what we're going to do is actually create a new user. And don't worry, we talk about this in our course. So if you're really interested in doing this, we go through all of these steps, step by step. But the idea of what I'm doing right here is I'm going to set up a user, and that this user is actually going to be used as our credential to sign into our Linux instance, rather than using local authentication on our Linux instance. So let's go ahead. I'm going to create myself a user. I'm going to call it Steven. Well, for its full name. And I'm going, now this is really important. If you're familiar with Active Directory, you know that in a Windows environment, by default, it always says the user must change their password on next login. Well, in a Linux environment, you don't want to have that set. Primarily for the reasons are, Linux doesn't know how to behave with that sort of behavior. You can't log into a Linux instance and then it force you to reset your password. That's not something that you can do without the use of third-party solutions. So we want to make sure that we uncheck that option when we're setting up users that are particularly going to be used in Linux environments. So I'm going to go ahead and set a password.
Within utilizing Active Directory, you're saying?
That's correct.
Not just because on local Linux accounts, you can absolutely do that using change.
No. That's exactly right. Yeah, this is going to be completely. Yeah, this is completely separate, because the idea behind this whole course is the fact that we're using Active Directory as our enterprise logon provider, right? This is our identity solution. And Linux doesn't know how to work with Active Directory in a Microsoft environment to be able to auto make you change your password on the first login. Okay, so we have this user set up called Steven. And let's go ahead, and I'm going to jump into the Linux instance that we first have to bind to our domain. I've already got what's called SSSD, realmd, KRB5 workstation installed. Talk about that in the course. We also talk about that in the Red Hat course for using an existing LDAP and Active Directory environment. We also have a live lab on that if you're interested in it. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually join this particular instance to the domain. And the way we do that using sudo is we use the realm command. And the realm command, we're going to do a join, and we're going to specify the user that's actually going to log into the domain. And so what we're interested at this time is I'm not using Steven to log into the domain. We're going to use an administrative credential, because at this point in time, we're a Linux administrator. We want to bind a brand new Linux server that other Active Directory users are then going to authenticate into. So right now, as the administrator, I need to use, for example, the administrative domain admin for our Active Directory domain. which happens to be for this environment, administrator at, and I believe it is ad.linuxacademy.com. That's the fully qualified domain name. And then we specify just the domain itself. So the username is the administrator at ad.linuxacademy.com. Domain is obviously ad.linuxacademy.com. Then we do the verbose command. And we'll hit enter. And I don't have Realm installed. And I thought I already had this pre-set up. I'm sorry about that. Let's go ahead and do that. So what I need to do is sudo yum.
It's all right. It's another process that we get to watch. That's very good.
Yeah, no problem. So the tools and the applications that are needed on a Linux server, and again, just to kind of throw this out there, you can do this on Ubuntu, you can do this on Red Hat 7, you can do this on CentOS. This happens to be the Linux AMI for Amazon, and they're all fully supported to be able to do this. So I'm going to do SSD, and I'm going to do Realm B. And then there's a package called KRB5 workstation. We're going to go ahead and install those packages. Okay, so once those packages are installed, now we do the join command. So again, that's going to be realm join. We specify our user. Our user is the administrator at ad.linuxacademy.com for the domain of ad.linuxacademy.com. Then we throw in the verbose flag at the end. It's going to ask us for the password of that administrator account. So I'm going to go ahead and enter that. And it helps if we enter the right password. So 1 second. Awesome. So now that we have this server actually bound to the domain, there is a couple more things that we have to do. And the first of that is we need to actually edit our SSH config so that password authentication is allowed, because by default, the Linux AMI instance does not do that. So I'm going to use VI here. Let's make sure we use sudo privileges. We're going to take a look at the etc ssh sshd_config file. We're going to look for this line right here that says password authentication. And we're going to go ahead and enable that. Save our file. And we're going to actually start.
You might want to go back and comment out the other line that had password authentication as no. On this version of Amazon Linux, it has the option twice instead of just changing it. Notice down right there.
Yeah, good call.
I don't think it has that on CentOS 7 or Red Hat 7, but this version of Amazon Linux, it is.
It sure does. So I'm going to go ahead. We'll make sure that that's changed. So one of the packages that we installed was the SSSD package, which is actually what's going to be needed for this. So
don't forget to restart it.
Start that service.
Well, I don't mind jumping in and just saying all of it. So there we go. I feel useful. There he is.
Oh, it's actually not started yet by default. We need to start it first.
I'm talking about the SSH service. SSH.
Well, we're going to reboot the server actually here in a minute, because when we bind this to the domain, there are issues until we actually reboot it. So the service itself will not allow us to work right away. So there's a couple more things that I want to talk about before we actually reboot this, and that is we have the opportunity to only allow certain users to bind using Active Directory to our server. So the Steven user that we set up a few minutes ago, we can make it to where only he has access to log on to this server. We also have the ability to allow only certain groups in Active Directory to log on to the domain. So for example, if I had just, for example, I don't know, domain admins, this was a server that only the domain admins of my domain, I wanted to be able to log on to this Linux server, I could certainly allow that using the realm permit command. Again, I can do that so I can do it on groups or users. So this is really where some of the power of managing Linux servers really come in using existing enterprise solutions such as Active Directory. So what we're going to do is we're going to specify just one user can log on to this domain, but we're going to do that after a reboot. So let's go ahead. I'm going to reboot my server. And while we're waiting a few minutes, if anybody has any questions, I would be happy to go over them.
Just restart the SSHD service. I'm kidding.
Did you see that root message on the reboot command?
Root message. Did I miss something?
Yeah.
He just missed sudo, I think.
One thing I want to mention while we're doing this is if you're an environment that actually does Windows servers and you want to use Active Directory to administrate those Windows servers, you can actually use what's called a seamless join on your servers. And basically what allows you to do is to set up a role and a policy in Amazon Web Services so that whenever you spin up brand new Windows servers, it'll automatically join and bind to the domain without you actually going in and doing a step-by-step process on that Windows server. And we definitely talk about that in the course as well. Unfortunately, at this point in time, you cannot do that with Linux instances without some special trickery and some scripting on the back end, which is also possible. Okay, so I am SSH'd back into our server, and I'm logged in as the default user using my domain PEM file. But what I want to show you now is back when I talked about a minute ago, we use what's called a realm permit. So I can specifically approve a particular login to log into this particular domain. Another thing that I want to show you is that we can allow the domain administrator group to, using the sudos file, to automatically have sudo privileges. So just like any user on a local user account on a Linux machine, we can give users sudo privileges. We can also do that to the Active Directory users by specifying a group. So I can give the complete domain administrators group, which is an Active Directory group, already domains probably for your enterprise anyways. If they were also going to be the same administrators of a bunch of Linux servers, you would want to add that to the local sudoers file as well. So let's go ahead and do that real quick. So I'm going to use sudo, and I'm going to use the vi sudo, and we're going to take a look. Use the f file, etc. Sudoers file. And at the very bottom, we're just going to create a new line. Again, I'm going to allow what's called domain admins privilege to be able to log in and have sudo privileges right away without having to have them su to the root account itself. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to type domain administrators at the fully qualified domain name, which is ad.linuxacademy.com. And we're going to give it all.
So you do have to specify that domain every time?
Yes, you do. And the reason I'm specifying this domain is because this is actually the fully qualified username. So it's not just that I'm specifying that use this domain. The username itself is going to be you have to do the fully qualified domain name. So obviously the backslash here is because it's Linux and we have a space and the actual group name. So I've got %domain/administrators at ad.linuxacademy.com, and I'm giving them full rights to use sudo. All right, looks good. So I'm going to save that file. And so now, using the realm permit, let's actually permit the administrator account to actually SSH to this particular server. So I'm going to use sudo, and I'm going to do realm permit. And let's go ahead and give administrator at ad.linuxacademy.com access to SSH to the server. And while we're at it, let's go ahead and use sudo realm permit Stephen at ad.linuxacademy.com access to log on to this server as well. Okay, so let's open up a new tab and let's make note of what our public IP address is for our Linux server. And I'm going to SSH now into this server using my Active Directory credential. So the administrator of the domain gave me access to log into the server. I'm Stephen. I'm going to do SSH Stephen at, and it's going to be the domain name. So ad.linuxacademy.com. followed by the public IP address of what that server is. It's going to ask me for my password. And sure enough, I am now logged on to my Linux server using Steven, which is that brand new Active Directory credential that we set up at the beginning of this particular video. So if I do a pwd, notice it also creates a home directory called Steven at ad.linuxacademy.com as well. All right, so if we wanted to remove just one user, Steven, he no longer works at the company, we would do a sudo realm permit -- withdraw. That is correct. And then we're just specify the user again. So it's just going to be Steven at ad.linuxacademy.com. And so now over here, let me log out as my user. And so if I was to try to log back in and I entered my password, I'm going to close the connection every single time because it no longer allows that user because of this withdraw command. So for example, if I went up here and we permitted Steven again, I came over here and entered my password, he's going to be able to log in because he's now permitted. So that is basically the rundown of a lot of things that we're going to set up in this particular course. One, the site-to-site VPN. We talk about setting up managed services for Active Directory with AWS managed solutions and spinning up our own EC2 instances and spinning up Active Directory ourselves. And we talk about both binding Linux servers, Windows servers, and many other things all throughout the course.
That's great. Thanks for sharing that with us, Stephen. I mean, and when you're working with Active Directory, and again, you show how you're working on-premise, and I believe in your course you use the simple AD service as well, part of Active Directory's options. So there's actually a lot of different ways, whether you're using federated services, identity federation, basically, whether you're connecting and running Active Directory with trusts from one area to another area, or whether you're using simple AD service. So it's actually pretty kind of a pretty complex setup, and I think you cover most of that inside your course. So I appreciate you taking the time to stop by. Christoph, do you have any questions?
Well, I was just going to say, it looks really nice that you're able to have such fine-grained control. It's not just the users. You can also have groups and stuff like that. And if you do want to get rid of their permissions, then you can easily do it with one command. That's so, yeah, thanks a lot, Stephen.
Yeah. Thanks, guys.
Great job. Thanks, Stephen. Thanks, Christoph, for Cloud Cadet Episode 4, Active Directory and Amazon Web Services. Good night, everyone.